Is the big gallery all set? Okay, ready for us to start? Good morning, everyone. Bright and early. You're in Washington, D.C. We like to make you work to come to our GMF event. It's great to see you all. It's so great to have Connor Coleman here with us today. I will grab the mic.
It's my Midwestern twang, too, that does not carry quite so well. So I've got a couple pieces of paper here because there's so many great things to talk about with regards to the DFC. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the German Marshall Fund. It is our pleasure to host you here today. For those coming in late, you're welcome to sit in the front row. We've got lots of room up here. And we're here to discuss transatlantic cooperation on critical minerals, which we're delighted to convene in partnership with our colleagues from the American-German Institute, Jeff and Peter, who will be hosting our second panel. So we at the German Marshall Fund bring together policymakers, industry leaders, and experts from both sides of the Atlantic to facilitate dialogue, as we believe that some of the most important conversations happen in forward-looking, solutions-oriented policy settings. These conversations help us identify where transatlantic interests align and where they diverge. And importantly, where we can find common ground and how to move forward. These conversations can drive policy and create new plans of action for Europe and the US. Few issues illustrate this more clearly than the critical minerals issues. They have been rapidly emerging as a strategic and geopolitical choke point, and is a topic that we'll discuss from a lot of different angles today. They also benefit greatly from joint action. It's very hard for one country really to combat the issues that we have on critical minerals at the moment. And so it's an area where the cooperation, particularly between the transatlantic partners, is important. So we're going to explore these dynamics from both the strategic and operational perspective. We're also going to learn a little bit more about the DFC and their role in this process. I know the DFC primarily from their predecessor organization, which was the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, but they've been changed and had their mandate, I think, expanded greatly over time to do more and to help the U.S. economy more in various ways. So it's a great pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Connor Coleman, Head of Investment at the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. He brings extensive experience in global capital markets and cross-border investments. He's also a fabulous soccer player, if anybody needs help getting a kid recruited to play in college, and has played a key role in advancing U.S. strategic priorities. Sorry, that was okay on soccer.
No, of course.
Okay, football for the Europeans that are watching online. Connor,
I prefer football too.
And hey, we're about to start World Cup, so it's all going to be about football all the time. Connor, we're very grateful you could join us this morning, and we look forward to your insights. So let me kick it off. I'm going to ask Connor a few questions, and then we'll open it to the audience. So please think about what you may want to ask. I have lots of questions, but we'll be happy to yield to others. So for those less familiar with the DFC, how would you describe your core mission and mandate? What makes you distinct from other development finance institutions, particularly when it comes to playing a part in economic statecraft? And maybe you could touch too upon some of the new authorities you've gotten through your reauthorization and through other things.
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, it's an honor and a privilege to be with you all today, so thank you very much for having me. The U.S. Development Finance Corporation is the international investment arm of the U.S. government and central to economic statecraft. We aim to mobilize private capital for the purposes of driving U.S. foreign policy objectives and promoting economic development in our investments. We aim to secure returns for the U.S. taxpayer, create economic markets and ecosystems with our investments, and secure strategic supply chains for the United States and our allied partners. You're right, DFC is a relatively new organization built on the backbones of our predecessor agencies, OPIC and the for-profit lending arm of USAID. It was formed in 2019 under the first Trump administration, really for the purposes of being the counterweight to China's One Belt, One Road initiative. And under this administration and President Trump's leadership, this institution has really gone through a revamp and moved maybe away a little bit from a traditional development finance institution, more so to like a strategic investment vehicle or fund. And I really like to highlight three things from our recent reauthorization that kind of exemplifies that. The first is our investment capacity increased from $60 billion to $205 billion. So now we have significant more capital to deploy for the purposes of aiding economic development and partnering with our allies to secure supply chains. When you think about our current AUM and our reauthorization over the next 6 years to get to the $205 billion number, that's roughly $27.5 billion of annual deployment, which makes us one of the largest providers of liquidity globally. The second key change was we were now able to invest in any country internationally regardless of income classification. Historically speaking, I could only invest in what was deemed low income or lower middle income markets. Now I can invest in Europe, for example. And then finally, the last key difference is we have more of an ability to take risk and get creative with our financial product. Historically speaking, I think this agency focused on three different types of investments. One was senior secured project finance lending. The second was providers of political risk or guarantee products. And the third was what I call intermediary investing into funds or investing into regional on banks that then in turn invested in country. Now we have more of an ability to be creative, and Ben, our CEO, and I come from the private sector in kind of a special situations, distressed investing model. So you're going to see us more play in the common equity or the structured equity or the mezzanine equity, all with the lens of how can we be more creative and meet the private sector where they need and be that bridge in the capital to where what can the public sector provide, what can the private sector provide, and then we're going to be that spot that makes the capital structure pencil to make the investment thesis take.
Great. So your three main products are lending, insurance, and equity investments. Is that right? In terms of how you, for the novice financial person, how to think about how they can, you dabble in investing.
So I will expand it slightly.
Okay.
So lending, absolutely. We can invest in any type of kind of debt instrument, whether that be senior secured, mezzanine, or more support structure instruments. Second is equity. The third is our political risk insurance product. Fourth is guarantees. Fifth is platforms or joint ventures, I would say. We utilize the private sector expertise and partner with them. And then lastly, we do have a project development capability, which is actually really essential for helping promoting some of the critical mineral projects, and we can get into that more later.
That's awesome. Thanks for that clarification. So you have your mission is advancing U.S. foreign policy and aligning that with economic development around the world. Can you talk a little bit about how your investments advance both objectives and how you measure their success, as well as how you protect the U.S. taxpayer from risk?
Great question. First and foremost, my institution does not invest capital for the sake of investing capital. We really put U.S. foreign policy as the umbrella that drives our investment thesis. And that really comes from close coordination with our board of directors, which is the Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Commerce, and the USAID administrator, as well as the White House. So we are building a pretty robust foreign policy team within the DFC to be the interlocutors, both within our own government and international governments, to really help form our key investment thesis across the board. However, at the same time, I also have a fiduciary responsibility to the U.S. taxpayer to make money. And I think how we go about this is really moving away from our views of impact and strategic and financial returns solely on a deal-by-deal basis and take a portfolio view of this. Because I'm going to have a portfolio that is more what I call catalytic in nature, where it's taking in probably a lower return than the private sector would, but has a massive impact, whether that be a strategic importance of securing the supply chains or promoting economic development in host countries. And I will offset that, but maybe having a more commercially aligned portfolio as well that promotes private capital mobilization in countries. So on a portfolio basis, I know I'm getting the impacts I want for our U.S. and the allies, as well as the financial return to the U.S. taxpayer.
Right, so it's looking at the bigger picture as opposed to looking at deal by deal exactly what you're going to be bringing.
Correct.
It's awesome. So I love this quote. So your chairman, who I think you've worked with for a while, coming out of the private sector,
I have.
Apparently likes the Marshall Plan.
It's one of his favorite things to talk about.
So, and in a recent speech, I'm going to read a little quote, just because we're the German Marshall Fund, so I kind of have to. The United States invested in rebuilding its allies through the Marshall Plan after World War II. The Marshall Plan rebuilt war-torn Europe's production capabilities and transformed Europe nations into participants of the American system. Although it's often overlooked, over 70% of the Marshall Plan funds were spent on procuring U.S. goods and services. In exchange for capital investment, America was granted first priority to develop critical minerals. The success of America's investment in Europe limited growing threats of communism, hardwired international markets for U.S. business, and contributed to decades of global stability and growth. So what a great call out to the Marshall Plan and the success it had. Building on that, and given DFC's important role at the center of U.S. economic statecraft, how do you see initiatives like what I think is quite an innovative idea around the Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund? And your broader approach, how does this all fit within this kind of new picture that we have out there?
Well, first and foremost, I'll let you in on a little secret. Ever since the president made the phone call to Ben and offered him the chance to run the DFC, I'm pretty sure I've heard about the Marshall Plan every single week from him. So it is truly one of his favorite things to talk about. And I think it's one of the right examples, because right now something we're thinking through in the DFC is what is economic development in the world today? And I think we often point to this Marshall Plan as one of the greatest examples of economic development seen in history. Because what it really was able to accomplish is that through investments, it created economic ecosystems and economic markets between the United States and our European allies that still exist today. And I think we're trying to revert a little bit back to that model of how can we create these economic ecosystems in markets through our investment strategy. And I think this Ukraine Reconstruction Fund is a great example of that. This fund is a first of its kind vehicle that happened within the DFC. It's a joint partnership between the United States and Ukraine. It's structured as a perpetual capital vehicle to continue to invest within Ukraine now during the conflict and for years to come post-conflict, looking to promote not only U.S. business, but U.S. aligned and our allied businesses as well. So we're really excited about that example, and we do think this is kind of a newer model of the Marshall Plan and something we're looking to recreate in other markets going forward.
And the way it's structured, kind of both Ukraine and the U.S. win. I mean, how do you see how that was structured as being beneficial in terms of this development discussion that we're talking about?
Absolutely. So all the proceeds stay within Ukraine for promoting the development of infrastructure, critical minerals, energy, and emergent technology right now. So there's a small capital contribution from both kind of the Ukrainian government. There's a capital contribution for the U.S. government directly into the fund. We're also bringing our new expanded balance sheet directly into the project level. We're forming co-investment vehicles with the private sector and our kind of allied partners across the board. I think the number quoted by the World Bank is $550 billion needed to aid in Ukraine's reconstruction over the next kind of decade. This is a perfect example of utilizing a catalytic vehicle, bringing in partners in private sectors and offering stability and a chance to invest their capital and earn the return that they need while still creating economic markets and promoting the development of war-torn Ukraine.
And so one of the things that I've heard about the fund too is that it's seen as being a signal for investors looking to go into Ukraine as the U.S. government is investing via this vehicle, then it's going to be an investment that's safer, more secure. It's the signal that it's sending as well into the marketplace. I mean, is it? I'm sure it's more than that, but that's one of the things I've heard is a benefit of it. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would say overall, look, the benefit of the fund, and frankly the benefit of investing with an institution like the DFC, is not necessarily the capital. Obviously that is very beneficial. It's the stability provided, and the fact that we're planting the United States government flag, or in this case, a joint U.S.-Ukraine flag into the project. And as problems arise in these projects within Ukraine or the emerging world, because they are always going to arise, you're going to get the benefit of the United States and Ukraine to really come in, be that bridge between the public and the private sector, and really make sure the private sector is making the rate of return that they need, because at the end of the day, that's what the private sector needs to actually deploy significant capital into these projects.
Great, thank you for that. So as we think about the U.S. and partners like those in the EU, how can we work together to mobilize more resources for some of our investments? And here I'm thinking about things like the connectivity corridors that are being talked about in Africa, as well as connecting Europe with Asia. Is there more we could be doing together to leverage what you guys do, what the EIB does, what EBRD does, et cetera, to make sure that we're not being duplicative, but we're being, through collaboration, we're doing more?
Absolutely. Collaboration is absolutely essential for solving these critical issues. For example, going back to the Ukraine fund, with EBRD, we're sharing our pipeline between the fund and what they have, looking at ways to co-invest together. We do the same with EIB in kind of other geographies across the board. So I think on a institution to institution level, we do a very good job of trying to share pipeline in the overlapping countries where we have kind of the similar objectives across the board. Obviously, I think the next step is not just outside kind of the other development finance institution or multilateral development, is how do you get more connectivity between the private sectors, whether that be the alternative asset managers, the sovereign wealth funds, the investment banks, both in the United States and kind of over in Europe, to join in on this development. I think sometimes in certain markets, multilaterals and development finance institutions tend to actually crowd out private capital instead of crowd in private capital. So it's on us to be more creative with our product suite to how can we bring them in alongside of us to enhance that collaboration.
Yeah, well, I would think you guys bring the equity piece in that sometimes the Europeans are more focused on the lending piece. Mm-hmm. And I think that would be quite helpful.
Very much so.
Synergies.
We all have different authorities and investment capabilities, and how can we mix and match what we all bring to fit the right capital structure?
Great. I mean, the U.S. government has a lot going on with critical minerals at the moment, like a lot.
It's very much in vogue right now.
Help us understand a little bit, because there's like Project Volt, there's a plurilateral, there's Pax Silica, there's the US-EU bilateral MOU and other MOUs with a lot of countries around the world. How should we be thinking about how the U.S. government is approaching all the different dimensions of the critical mineral issue, and what role do you guys play specifically in that?
Good question. I would say, first and foremost, it is a very coordinated effort within the U.S. government happening right now with all the key different agencies of how do you solve this critical issue of securing critical mineral supply chains for the United States and our allied partners. I really break it down to three key initiatives. The first is stockpiling, and how do you have enough stockpile for commercial and defense applications, both for the United States and our allied partners. That's where initiatives like Project Vault really come in and help aid the stockpiling efforts. The second is investments. How do you take a mineral by mineral approach and secure vertical integration across upstream mining, midstream processing, and downstream manufacturing. That's where investment agencies like the DFC or the Office of Strategic Capital or other U.S. government economic agencies come in. And the last is this idea of price support. How can we partner with our allies to offer an ex-China market price and help aid the industry for a period of time? One of the key issues right now about really mobilizing the private sector into critical minerals is they have no ability to underwrite the price for the investment. That means they have no surety of the rate of return that they're going to make for the investment. So they're not going to invest. So we're thinking creatively across the board of how can we collaboratively offer some of this price support to kind of effectuate the market.
I think the price issue is the toughest one to tackle.
By far.
Fewer tools, needs a lot of political will, a lot of allies coming together, it feels like.
Very much so.
Yeah. Well, great. Okay. Well, next up, I'm going to turn to all of you in the audience. So just to get some questions ready. My final question to you is: so thinking about our European allies, I mean, what we have the MOU. It talks about some of these issues. It talks about mining and processing, also about recycling, advanced material investments, other things. What, from your perspective, how do you think the success of this MOU is going to be measured between the two developed economies of the United States and Europe? I mean, how are we going to, through this MOU, work together to maybe tackle some of these issues we just talked about? What do you think is the most important elements for us to be looking at in that work stream?
I think success is measured really on, if you look over the next 5 years or the next couple of years, we're not having conversations like this about critical mineral supply chain issues. Truly, when you look at the quantum of dollars needed to secure critical minerals and secure and promote the supply chain, this is an issue that can be solved over the next 5+ years through coordinated efforts. This is not so that's how I view success, is we're not having these conversations about critical minerals. We're talking about the next supply chain issue when we all sit down here too. I think this is the right first step for kind of the US and European relationships. I know at the economic agency levels between all the governments, we've been talking about this issue for much longer, but this is a very strong signal to the market. And at the end of the day, what the market needs right now for critical minerals is stability. And this is a perfect example of helping to start provide that stability, because this issue is not solved with just the United States or just Europe. It's really solved by a very collaborative effort together.
Great. Thank you so much for that. So I'm opening the floor to the audience if there's any questions. I've got Emily in the front row as our first brave person, and I've got Ruth number 2. So Emily, and please introduce yourselves when you...
Okay, thank you. Emily Benson from our Commerce Department, currently at Minerva Technology Futures. Thank you very much, and sorry I was a little bit late. So maybe you covered this earlier, but I'm wondering if you could share some additional insights about the way that you guys are partnering or complementing some of the efforts, particularly on the EXIM side with magnet supply chains and then critical mineral efforts in Europe. I know that you're statutorily limited in where you can operate and with whom, but let's say that Sweden comes online. Is that something that you might be able to help underwrite, go in and de-risk? Or what about magnets in places like Germany? How do you foresee DFC either complementing or deepening those investments, particularly in Europe?
Yeah, great question. So 2 parts to it. One, post our reauthorization that just happened in December, we now have expanded authorities to actually invest within Europe. There's 2 key limitations just from a statute perspective about investing within Europe. One is in kind of those wealthy countries, we can only be 25% of the total project costs. Again, our job is to mobilize private capital, so we don't want to be taking a majority position of the total private cost, but we can take up to 25%. And the second is, of my total portfolio, only $20 billion can be in the wealthy countries at any one time. But still, a massive development from where we were previously about the ability to actually invest within Sweden or these other kind of European countries. So we're really ramping up our strategy and our pipeline here And our view of how do we invest in Europe is how do you connect the dots to the emerging market world? Oftentimes what you're seeing in the market is maybe some of the midstream or downstream is really happening in places like Europe, Canada, Australia, United States, and how do we pair our emerging market investments in kind of the upstream in Africa to these processing facilities, and again, promote these economic ecosystems. And we are very closely partnering with Exim Bank. Ben and John Jonovitz are actually very close friends, so we speak, I would say, daily with Exim of how to solve this. We actually brought the Office of Strategic Capital within the Department of War, and they sit in the DFC building, so we have very good close collaboration with George Colatis and Ryan Linder there. Greg Beard, who is leading kind of the new energy dominance financing arm of the Department of Energy, is an ex-energy banker from Apollo that Ben and I knew from before kind of the government days. So there's a lot of really strong connectivity between, I would say, the key front office leadership, because we all realize we have different investment authorities, we have different capabilities, whether that be domestically or internationally. And again, the name of the game with critical minerals investing is how do we connect the dots to secure the supply chain.
So can I ask, we've released a paper on the Arctic and economic development in the Arctic. And one of the things we propose is using the Ukraine Reconstruction Fund as a model for investing in critical minerals in certain Arctic countries, most of which are developed economies.
Yeah.
Is that something you guys would consider or are looking at?
I would say the idea of how do you replicate, maybe not exactly, but a model like URIF, whether that be additional funds or kind of holdco, opco structures, and bring in private sector and public sector dollars to aid an initiative like this is very much something we are considering and looking at across the board for different administration priorities.
Okay, well, we'll come back to you on the Arctic.
Fair.
And I think you were looking at it in Congo too at some point, right, Stephanie? So, okay, Ruth, I think is our next question.
Thank you very much. Ruth Schipper, Netherlands Embassy, working on trade before with a background in Netherlands Treasury and World Bank. I haven't heard you speak to the role of IFC and World Bank yet, so I'm curious where you see their parts of the institutions to also work with you all. And out of curiosity, we know this U.S. administration to be very agile. When they have an ambitious goal, they will use the whole toolbox to get there. So I'm wondering, what does that mean for your institution's risk appetite? And do you also see the EU be as similarly agile? Can they actually keep up?
So on the first one, the role of World Bank and IFC and our investment strategy. One, we have a very close relationship with World Bank and IFC across the board. Frankly, I was just speaking with Mokhtar, the head of the IFC, on critical minerals and how do we kind of work on the pipeline together. So we're beginning kind of these strategies. We often think very alike, I would say, with World Bank, IFC on some of the strategies within critical minerals. Take their investment into Appian, which is kind of their fund to deploy capital at scale for critical minerals and use the private sector expertise, is very similar to our partnership with ADQ and Orion for our critical minerals consortium vehicle. So we're often deploying and sharing knowledge of like what is best to the best way to tackle this difficult issue. And the second question of, sorry, it was us being agile across the board, and how can the EU necessarily come up and what does that mean for our role? Look, I would say this administration has really put investments at the forefront of a lot of its diplomacy. When you look across the board and you see who are running these key U.S. government agencies, it's investment professionals with significant business experience. You have Secretary Bessent and kind of his hedge fund mind and team at the Treasury Department. You have Secretary Lutnick and his investment banking background running the Commerce Department. You have Deputy Secretary Feinberg in private equity at the Department of War. You have John Jonovitch and his trading and commodities background at Exxon. Obviously, Greg Beard in the private equity mindset at Department of Energy, and then you have Ben with a distressed special situations background there. So it's a very coordinated effort which allows us to move agile and speak the private sector language, which is, granted, I'm new to DC, but it's something that I think is very unique to this administration. As for our ability to take additional risk, that is definitely something we're pushing at the DFC. Ben and I come from distressed special situations investing background, so I think we have a little bit more of a risk appetite than maybe traditional leaders of development finance institutions. So we are trying to push the mold and think creatively here. I would say our European partners are definitely on the right track in getting there. I'm definitely starting to see over the past year them starting to think more creatively, push the boundaries, push the mold to solve these critical supply chain issues.
Other questions? There's one over there.
Hi. Hi.
Maybe just give it like.
Okay. Oh, Lauren Piper at Rhodium Group. Thank you so much for your time. You mentioned the third aspect of U.S. strategy is on price floors. I'm curious if you could speak to, we've mentioned the sort of complexity politically of operationalizing a price floor, of course, the data challenges. I'm curious if you could speak to the challenges related to the effects on downstream producers, if there's been any discussions within DFC or broadly in the U.S. government on how to account for those differences for downstream producers.
So for the live stream, just to capture, the question is about price floors and the impact on the downstream industries.
Yeah, by far and away, price floors are the toughest part to crack and find a solution here. But they're absolutely essential if you want to drive capital at scale. I think the easiest sector or part of the value chain to invest in is the upstream and upstream mining. The midstream processing and the downstream manufacturing, definitely a little bit tougher of a business model, particularly the midstream. They're the lowest margin business. It's the lowest kind of area that you can really afford a negative effect in until you're losing profit dollars. So price support is really focused, frankly, on the midstream and the downstream connective tissue to the upstream because private sector dollars are flowing at scale there. Again, it's a very coordinated effort between both public and private partners right now. I don't think the solution is just the public sector, and I don't think it's just the private sector. Overall, if you're going to see a lasting impact over the next 10 years across the board, we are already getting creative with partnering with our other kind of G7, G20 partners of creating ex-China market prices for specific minerals across the board, really with the lens of how do you promote the downstream manufacturing for magnets, batteries, and chips. That is kind of the key focus areas, I would say, right now.
So, I mean, what's the role? So there's price floors, there's offtake agreements, there's certain metals markets that you could potentially establish. But I think about Europe and all the money they're going to spend on defense over the coming years as a huge opportunity also because they're going to need a lot of these critical minerals, these rare earth minerals for a lot of what they want to do. I mean, what is the total toolkit on price supports that we could be thinking through, besides just having a general price floor that's out there?
How much time do you have? Look, I think you hit on some of the key ones. Obviously, the ability for governments to actually enter into secure offtake agreements at the mine level is a very key part of the strategy. It's definitely something we've been exploring here within U.S. government is how do you either, as part of our financing package, secure offtake rights from the U.S. government or bring in parties there. So within every loan agreement or equity investment I'm making on the upstream phase, I'm having very hard offtake provisions to making sure that offtake goes to the U.S. or U.S. aligned market prices, and really either partnering with governments to provide that offtake or bringing in the private sector to offer. So offtake, definitely one. Two, having greater transparency and liquidity in some of these minerals is absolutely essential. We've also been thinking about very deeply of how do you have a lot of these minerals are priced in Chinese currency, and and how can you get them priced in kind of, again, United States dollar or kind of the European currencies instead, and have a more liquid market in order to trade these. And then finally, I do think there is this idea of offering some type of minimum floor that gets the private sector up. I also think there's other remedies like tax considerations or tariffs as well too that you have to factor in to the overall ecosystem when you think about price support.
Great, thank you. Abby, our panelist on our next panel.
Hi, Abby Wolf.
Mic come in just so the online audience can hear you.
Thank you. I've really appreciated your comments so far. Abby Wolf, former critical minerals lead at the Department of Energy. I'm curious if you could elaborate on any risks that you see with the government's approach to equity investments in creating an ecosystem, as you say, as being very important domestically and also abroad. Having heard anecdotally that some companies are finding it difficult to raise private capital because their investors are saying, well, why didn't you get the equity investment? Thank you.
Yeah. A couple different points here. One, you're right, it's a signal to the market. It depends how the private sector views government involvement. Sometimes it's viewed as a stabilizing function, particularly in the emerging market world. And I think internationally, maybe that is very much the case. And maybe sometimes it's viewed as a destabilizing function of, hey, I couldn't raise the capital without the government. So I think it depends on the geography and the jurisdiction for that. I think other two big things worth thinking about very, very deeply at the DFC as we move into a more equity investing model is one, governance. Like, how do we have the adequate governance? And like, we're very cognizant here at the DFC that every 4 years, U.S. government policy shifts on a pendulum. So how do we get the private sector okay with some of these government's rights that we think are typical in equity investing and are necessary to facilitate the ecosystem? And then secondarily, as you move into a more equity investing mindset, inherently there's more liability associated with certain of the environmental and kind of risk associated with the project itself. Obviously, you have a responsibility as an equity investor in projects to the local community, to the environment, to other different liability functions that you don't necessarily have as great as a lender. So you have to make sure you have the right protections if you're going to make sure you're investing smartly and securing kind of the U.S. taxpayer dollars in the strategy.
That's a very interesting distinction, that as the equity investor, we have more responsibilities than as the lender. I think that's a really interesting dimension to the conversation. And I think, one of the things we haven't talked about, but obviously we have some health crises in Africa going on at the moment in some areas where we have a lot of mining. So how do we think about some of those responsibilities as well when we think about our equity investments and the fact that there's some conversation about how the Ebola has spread in some of the mining communities and may not have been detected quite as quickly as a result?
Yeah, so critical minerals is one of my 7 different sectors I get to focus on at the DFC. The others are infrastructure, energy, tech and telecom, food security and agriculture, healthcare, and financial services.
Just a few
small sectors that we get to focus on. But it's really important, and I think people oftentimes forget about the entire ecosystem needed to facilitate critical minerals investment. It's not just the mining, it's not just the processing, it's not just the manufacturing, it's the energy and infrastructure to actually facilitate that value chain, as well as making sure you have adequate food security and agriculture, aggregate healthcare systems, aggregate ecosystems in these countries. So something we are thinking about with our investment strategies, how do you pair these larger infrastructure, energy, or critical minerals projects with smaller healthcare, financial services, agriculture investments close by in surrounding geographies to promote that local community economic development and make sure that larger infrastructure play is economically viable.
Great. Last question I'll take Stephanie and then Sandra for the last 2 questions, and we'll take you one after the other.
Thank you. Stephanie Miley, currently here at GMF, but previously a Foreign Service officer. My last overseas assignment was 2 years in the Congo. I was in Kinshasa as the DCM, so we dealt with these issues on a daily basis. I was interested just now when you were talking about some of these risks, because I think key to what's going on in the DRC, which of course is such a critical player in this area, you have to deal with the corruption, you have to deal with the lack of infrastructure, and you have to deal, I think, for some of the investors with the reputational risk that's associated with the current situation of the Chinese having quite a predominant position there and being, how should we say, more willing to tolerate labor accidents, terrible labor conditions, environmental destruction. And so I'm just interested to hear how any investors that you're talking to are seeing specifically in the Congo, because as I say, it's the big shiny thing because of the concentration of critical minerals, but there are so many things that are working against the ability to really develop that as we would wish. Thank you.
And Sandra, last question.
Hi, Sandra Soon from the Singapore Embassy. I think Stephanie's question is a good segue into mine because I was interested in how you see the role of third countries, partners and allies. Obviously, Congo is an important consideration, but what sort of other priority countries is DFC looking at when you're thinking about where to place your investments?
Great questions. I would say, going back to our colleague's point over here, equity or debt investment by the US government or another government entity is probably necessary in a place like Congo for the private sector to want to invest. But I think this goes to our strategy with all kind of emerging market economies is our goal is to structure our investments and get the private sector comfortable where my institution is no longer needed to provide capital. The first time deploying into a country is always the scariest for the private sector. They don't know what they don't know. They don't know how they're going to make their return. But if you can prove a model where they can feel comfortable that they can make the return and honor that fiduciary responsibility to their LPs, then more dollars will flow into that economy. The Congo is definitely a very, very interesting market currently, given all the geopolitical factors going on. We have taken the approach where infrastructure and energy are absolutely essential before you can really promote the critical minerals ecosystem there. That's why we put such a focus on the Lobito corridor across the board as kind of our flagship project. For those of you who don't know that project, that is a recently $550 million investment by the DFC to restore some of the operations on the Angola portion of a railway that promotes kind of critical minerals flow going to the west at some of the Chinese rail infrastructure on the African continent. It is really important to extend that railway into the DRC, and there's a kind of an SNCC concession happening for that DRC portion of it that we've been very involved on the US government side to making sure that's secured by the correct officer to make that entire project economically viable. So to your point, I think infrastructure, I think agriculture, I think some of these other energy are really necessary as a first step to unlock a lot of the critical minerals that everyone talks about in the news within the DRC. And to your question on how do we think about geographies to invest in, again, we can invest in any country. The one place I can't invest is the United States of America. So opens up the entire world. So we really have kind of US foreign policy drive a lot of our investment decisions when it comes to the sectors. I think some of the key geographies you're hearing about in the news that we've been really pushed to think creatively on is Latin America and the Caribbean. How do we protect our own backyard and show up in a way kind of our foreign adversaries have for a number of years. The second is Central and Eastern Europe, particularly with the policy priority of how do you diversify away from foreign adversary supply of gas or some other energy supplies. Obviously, the Indo-Pacific region across the board is vital. Philippines, Vietnam, Southeast Asia. Central Asia is also a really up-and-coming focus for this administration. I think particularly you're seeing a lot of investments from us in the technology and telecommunications, and how do you promote in this interesting time from 5G to 6G, this diversification away from Huawei or ZTE to more trusted vendors. And then there's Africa, which is 25% of my portfolio and will still be a massive heavy focus overall. So there's no easy answer to that question. We look at everywhere across the board. It just really depends on the sector and the policy priority that we're looking to promote.
Okay, so last question. Who are you watching for the World Cup? Besides the U.S.
Besides the U.S., look, I lived in Madrid for a year. I love that country, so I'm a big Spain fan, and some other players like Lamine Yamal and others are very impressive.
Well, great. Well, a warm round of applause for Connor Coleman. Thank you for all the insights this morning, and also for the strong support of the Marshall Plan. We're going to move to our next panel, which is with Abby Wolf and with a German official who will be joining us online, and that conversation will be chaired by Peter Rashid, my partner from AGI, and so we will be transiting just for 30 seconds to that new panel, so stay tight, and thank you all.
Well, good morning from me. I'm Peter Rashish. I'm the Vice President and Director of the Geoeconomics Program at the American-German Institute. We're delighted to be here at GMF and cooperating with GMF today on this program on critical minerals. We're pleased to have two very fine speakers with us for this session. Sitting next to me here in Washington is Abby Wolf, and joining us from Berlin is Matthias Köhler. I also have a little bit of paper with me just to start off, so I will just mention a couple of things. To say that we hope to look at both the commercial and the policy dimensions of transatlantic critical minerals today, and to examine both some market dynamics, industrial policy questions, but also to get in a little bit into some systemic implications, what cooperation between the United States, Germany, and the EU means for how the international system, may start to look, including the role of the G7 and trading arrangements. And of course, our conversation today is happening with the backdrop of the April US-EU action plan for critical minerals critical mineral supply chain resilience. And then earlier there were two important meetings, one hosted by the Department of the Treasury, one by the State Department in January and February, and of course, in a policy sense, China's dominance of the market for these raw materials and its use of export controls is in the past year, I believe, on some of them. So before we begin today, let me introduce our two speakers. As I mentioned, in Berlin, we have Dr. Matthias Köhler, who has been the Deputy Director General for Raw Materials, the Circular Economy, Resource Protection, and Environmental Law in the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy since July 2025. He, I think very interestingly, served previously as Deputy Director General for SME financing and business startups at the KfW. The KfW is the German state-led development and investment bank. He has also worked previously as the head of what was then the G8 Sherpa office in the ministry, and worked as head of division for export finance. And he has, as someone who's often in the trade weeds, I'm also pleased to say that he's also been deputy head of the division in the division of foreign trade, and also in the permanent representation of Germany to the WTO in Geneva. And he does have a PhD in international public law with a focus on trade issues. Abby Wolf, to my right, is a critical mineral supply chain expert. She's had leading roles in both the Trump and Biden administration. She is currently the founder and CEO of Lattice Strategies, which is a mission-driven organization dedicated to securing American and allied critical mineral supply chains. She most recently served as the critical minerals lead for the U.S. Department of Energy during the current Trump administration's first 100 days, and she was previously hired to lead the Biden administration's flagship American Battery Materials Initiative, which was the White House-led effort to secure critical minerals for both energy and defense needs. And before that, she founded the Center for Critical Minerals Strategy at SAFE, which is a nonprofit dedicated to energy security and economic competitiveness issues. And she's also worked at NASA and the American Geosciences Institute. She has degrees in geology and public policy from Hamilton College and Johns Hopkins University here in DC. So let me start off the conversation with you, Matthias Köhler, but the question goes to both of you, but let me start with you, Matthias, in Berlin. Just to get us grounded a bit, which industrial sectors in Germany are most impacted by the need for resilience in critical minerals supply chains?
Yeah, thank you, and for having me in this important conference. And it's a great pleasure to speak here for my government. Yeah, let me start by saying that the world has changed a lot. As you mentioned, my own career, we had a rules-based system, and we had a lot of elements, so to speak, that were very much in favor of the German economy and its industrial base. Cheap energy, we had the innovative edge, and of course, the world was driven by a rules-based system and, in general, the thought of give and take. And that has changed dramatically. Not only a heavy dependency now on China, but also a will on the Chinese side to use export controls, as you mentioned, as a political tool for other ends. And on the other hand, of course, we've also a sharp turn of the US towards protectionism and tariffs outside the WTO system, which then has had an effect again on China and the US somewhat in a situation where one action will bring about a reaction, and at the end it's very difficult to say who really made things more difficult than before. But that's the situation we are in, and we have to face it. I would also say that our companies and also we as a political system have too long relied on that openness of the world economy, and now we have to adapt to it, and we do so. So to your question, it's fair to say that we still have a very strong industrial basis, be it machinery, be it cars, anything almost on our industrial base. There is a heavy dependency on critical raw materials. Very often the element itself is not so big really with regard to the end price, for instance, of the product, but it is of strategic importance. So this whole issue really is very important, is of vital interest to us, and we address this with other partners, the US, but also our partners in the EU and the G7 all over the place. Let me start with that.
Perfect. Thank you. Are we on? Yeah. Thanks very much, Matthias. Abby, let me ask you the same question. U.S. economy, U.S. manufacturing base, where you see the most concern when we're looking at critical minerals?
I mean, really all of them. Our world is becoming more electric, connected, and autonomous. You hear a lot, obviously, about the rise of AI and the AI race between the US and China. But what is also missing, I feel like most importantly in that conversation, is not just the fact that we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars to build new fabs in this country so that we can build the chips that go into the data centers that will fuel this increasingly digital world that we're going to be relying on, both for, our monetary policy and actions, but also what we believe and what we think. But all of those minerals that go into those fabs are acutely controlled by China right now, and there are export license controls on those right now for germanium, for gallium, for key inputs, for things that are going to fuel the chips that go into the data centers that fuel our services-oriented economies. In the previous administration, the focus was much more on clean energy technologies and on the transition to clean energy and on electric vehicles in particular. Those types of sectors are very important to focus on because they are so large. And when you're talking about bringing on large supply chains, big mining assets onto the market in ways in which companies can make money in our free market societies, you need that very large demand pull to bring those mines online. And the trite sort of typical example is talking about, you need the minerals that are in your phone. But when you're talking about the amount of lithium that's in a cell phone battery, you're talking about the order of sort of a couple grams, but when you're talking about an electric vehicle battery, you're talking about tens of kilograms. So again, you have that demand there and the reason for somebody to bring a new lithium asset online to fuel a new and growing market where there are potential national security implications. We've already seen those national security implications play out in our automotive sector here in the United States, most recently in October during the trade tit for tat with the US and China, when China cut off actually our supplies of permanent magnets to the US, and Ford had to shut down a facility outside of Chicago for around a week. It's interesting because then Ford 2 months later doubled down on their relationship with Chinese suppliers by signing an additional agreement with CATL, China's primary battery manufacturer. But again, it just sort of goes to show the tightrope, both politically and economically, that our companies have to walk right now in balancing resilience and their ability to get materials and not be coerced in such a way, but also maintain access to not only cheaper, but more reliable, quite frankly, inputs from Chinese suppliers right now when they have to make money and sell in a global market. So yes, automotive sector, the previous speaker said that, DFC doesn't invest just for the point of investing. And when we talk about critical minerals, although I study geology and I care very much about mining, we're not mining for the sake of mining either. We're mining for the sake of these key industrial sectors. And so yes, the automotive sector in the United States provides over $1 trillion to our economy, directly and indirectly around 5.5% to our GDP. And so we can't afford for the hollowing out of these key industrial sectors. If the rest of the world is moving toward more electric and connected vehicles, we need to make sure that our own domestic and allied manufacturers can compete in those same markets, that globally people want to buy those types of vehicles. And it's just much easier for somebody to buy that vehicle if it's cheaper, and it's much easier for that vehicle to be cheaper if you're vertically integrated and you don't have to worry about the cost of your battery.
Let me follow up on that and ask how you see the situation in the U.S. market in terms of critical minerals, resources. What are the challenges bringing those to market? What advantages that maybe that the United States has, and what are the key actions that this administration is taking to accomplish all those things?
I mean, there are several, but I think the key hurdle is that we have to figure out ways for our companies to make money. We don't have state-owned champions like our strategic adversaries do. When we talk about, even like when the copper executive order came out within the first 100 days of the Trump administration, talking about, making, whether it was making copper great again or whatever it was, but it was, we only have really one domestic copper mining champion in this country, Freeport-McMoRan, and it's just very difficult. You can't really tell them where to mine or when to mine. They're going to make that decision themselves as a private company. They previously held one of the largest cobalt assets in the DRC, and they actually sold that asset during the previous Trump administration to China Mali, because these were, they're purely financial decisions, they're economic decisions. And I feel like China has been able to sort of exploit our companies' desire, as our system has been set up, and no knocks against it, but to make money. And so the dependence on Chinese goods, Chinese inputs, Chinese expertise has certainly become, it is a feature of our system. It is not a bug in our system. It was something that we have been leveraging in order to make the margins on some of these low margin industries much bigger so our companies can make money. It's more efficient. And so I feel like that is sort of our biggest challenge. Embracing capitalism and free markets and making sure that our companies can make money, while also ensuring that they can price in resilience and understand what it truly means to be so reliant on a strategic adversary that does not necessarily have the same free market principles that we have. Having heard anecdotally that CATL and BYD are, competing in some ways, but also much more comfortable to sit very next to each other in terms of where they are in the market, if they're able to then control more market share cumulatively and together. It's not necessarily this cutthroat competition that you have in free market industries alone. Again, that's more anecdotally that I've heard, but it's a completely different mentality in terms of the individual and the individual company out there to make a profit versus, what's good for the party or good for the nation and the market share that they've been able to get.
Matthias Kohler, of course, Germany is also a free market economy, so are the others in the European Union more widely. How do you see the situation in the markets in your country or in Europe, and what are the principal actions that the German government is taking or that are happening in Brussels to deal with these market realities and shortcomings, advantages, either one?
Yeah. Well, I can very much agree to what has been said, that over decades, I think our thinking was that the combination of democracy and free markets, that economic decisions are taken basically at level of companies and corporates and not at government level. We had the feeling to be superior to all the other systems out there. And one has to say that in particular with regard to many of the latest developments, disruption has been understood by the Chinese system very systematically, and they have built up systems. They've used their economic power for very strategic decisions they have taken. And that's the strategic challenge we are in today. So in a way, I think that relation between us as governments and our own economy also has to be adapted. And I can make this quite concrete in the field of critical raw materials. Over decades, the German government supported raw materials and the supply of raw materials through a debt program, a guarantee program. You had an offtake in Germany and a credit relation to a supplier out there. And then, for instance, copper supply was secured by that system. So the state would give the guarantee, but the credit was made on company level, or maybe also through a bank, but that was the system. And now we feel and we see that access to critical raw materials becomes crucial in the field of rare earths, but also copper or other lithium. And so what have we done? We have given us a new instrument, a raw material fund that now takes equity and goes into projects directly. This is really not what is in my DNA, so to speak, but now I'm in charge of that because there's an economic reasoning behind it, and also with other partners like France, Italy, and of course the US has also, through US Axim and also the Defense Ministry of Defense, changed gear now. And this shows very clearly, we've done our first investments, one rare earth investment in Australia, one lithium project here in Germany. We are now in a due diligence for a copper investment in Canada. And this shows systematically in a way how we change. And it is the state who will take the share. And normally that wouldn't have been in our thinking over decades, but now it is. And it shows that we have to change also our attitude and really build up a completely new system. And one last point, maybe not to be too long in my intervention now. Within the European Union, since 2 years, we have the Critical Raw Materials Act. And in this act, we set ourselves certain benchmarks, in fact, reducing our dependency on supply from certain players, China, of course, in particular, but also bringing forward recycling, which is really also of key importance, which you can see again. The Chinese are heavily now engaging in recycling, and they are even buying raw materials, used stuff here from the EU, and we are working on that. Do we want this again in the sense of a market economy? You would say no, that's open markets, and we benefit from that also in other markets. But still, we have a partner here. also to say this, we still are very much cooperating with China. Our minister was in China last week, and there was a lot of engagement in the sense also we need to be cooperative, but I think we must be realistic also about China, and so also recycling has become a contentious bone, if you like, and so we have to be more active here and promote recycling in our own economy.
We heard Abby mention this anecdote about how one company, private sector company, a decision one private sector, U.S. private sector company made faced with certain realities, opportunities in the market. What can be realistically expected of German private sector companies from your point of view, sitting in the Ministry of Economic Affairs? Given that Germany is a market-based economy.
I think the key target for us all must be diversification. That's really key, and we can reach that aim through different tools. And with regard to the companies you are now addressing, I think it's off-takes. It's really off-takes because the big issue is if you want to reach economic viability with new projects in the field of raw materials, it's always you have to invest, and then after a certain period of time you produce, and then comes the moment in time when the market test is there and you have to compete with the world market. And so far, to be very honest, my view is with regard to also German big corporates, they have gone where the market, where the price is the cheapest. And I think they have to diversify. Already within the Critical Raw Materials Act, we've set ourselves certain quotas. And I think we have to work now with our private sector that they have to find ways it will cost a certain premium. I think that's very clear, because China also plays on this. I mean, the matter of dumping, we've seen that in projects in the last few decades. They have sort of made lives of new projects very difficult through dumping mechanisms. And so in that respect, we need off-takes from our companies that are willing also to pay, at least to a certain extent, a higher price, but to have a more resilient market position. It's a kind of hedging that we see, for instance, with airlines. They have been doing that for decades. And I think that sense, that philosophy of hedging will be important. And companies must buy into this philosophy if we want to really tackle that challenge in the coming years.
Abby, how does that sync with your view?
Absolutely. Again, we need to give companies a way to make money in ways that support our values. And so that means that I think the tariff rate quotas are going to be essential. We talk about daisy chaining these projects together, getting off-take, and quite frankly, it's where the Mineral Security Partnership has fundamentally failed, because we sort of thought, well, yeah, of course, maybe these manufacturers just haven't heard of these mines before. And I mean, to some extent, kind of. But then you have their whole procurement teams and bankers and people who have really been engrossed in this whole ecosystem for such a long time. And so just the idea that like these companies had never heard about each other, or these opportunities just maybe they just didn't know about them, was just fundamentally flawed. I think from the beginning, you have to give the company, whether it is Volkswagen or whether it is Ford, the reason to buy that material. And so just because we're producing more doesn't mean China is producing less. And when you're talking about two fungible assets, just making them the same cost, because yeah, the company will say, yes, we'll buy the US or German or allied whatever material as long as the price is right. Because again, they have margins, they have shareholders, they have fiduciary responsibilities, they're there to make money. And so that's how we get caught up in this conversation of price floors. Because yes, and of course, you get very limited information from these companies as well in terms of their business proprietary information, because the margins for each company are incredibly sensitive in business proprietary information, and the margin that they're giving for one supplier may be incredibly different for a margin that they're giving to another supplier. So coming up with one set price floor isn't really something that a company is going to be very willing to sort of give you that very sensitive data, because there probably isn't an easy answer for developing that one single price floor. Unfortunately, that leaves policymakers with incredibly blunt tools and sort of grasping and guessing at percentages, which is for the most part kind of how policy gets done. But I mean, you have like the 30D clean vehicle tax credit that sort of just, it threw out amounts and let the market respond. And respond the market did, for at least a brief shining moment before guidance was initiated. You had companies having conversations with small startups in completely different ways than they had been having previously. Where previously the conversation with a small non-China startup was, come talk to me when you can get to China's prices. But as soon as the juicy carrot of getting, a tax credit for a consumer, for an electric vehicle, and then you had some companies that were better positioned to actually take advantage of that tax credit, started this race toward actually trying to create ex-China supply where they could take advantage of this carrot. At first we were worried that the carrot wasn't going to be juicy enough, but then you saw everybody moving, and you just sort of picked a number, And so I feel like in lieu of companies giving us some of this business sensitive information, we sort of have to come up with some more numbers to give them something that we can pressure test our assumptions against. And so, you need to either make the good that you don't want them to buy more expensive, or you need to give them incentive, whether it's a credit subsidy or something for the material that you want them to buy. When the United States implemented the Inflation Reduction Act with the 45X production tax credit and with the 30D clean vehicle tax credit, a lot of our allies got really mad because they didn't have the same, piggy bank that they could draw from for something that was going to be so expensive. And I mean, the Congressional Budget Office, I think, initially said that the 10-year 30D clean vehicle tax credit was going to be around $14 billion over 10 years, but some estimates had that around $200 billion over 10 years, and that's not something that every single country can do. And so I'm actually a little bit surprised that more countries aren't more willing to have the tariff conversation and the tariff rate quota conversation, because that's something where you don't necessarily have to have big government coffers to implement. And so, yes, a harmonized tariff, a harmonized incentive, you probably need both, and they need to be timed. The other thing with these supply side measures, whether it's European funds, Canadian funds, American funds, or equity investments on this supply side, is again, it doesn't really help to give the Fords or the Volkswagens the reason to buy that new material. And so what you might actually be doing, which was something that we were quite worried about in the previous administration, was inadvertently making your own economic investments, your own mining investments, uneconomic, because the markets for these things are still developing. You don't necessarily, you're flooding your own market essentially and dropping the price of your own commodities that are already so precarious as it is. And so you might be putting your own higher on the cost curve projects out of business because they can't compete at that cost, which is again how you end up in the price floor conversation. So it's a bit circuitous. But I do feel like the steps that the US and the EU are taking with the Critical Minerals Action Plan, the Compact, and then what the Trump administration has begun with the ministerial, whether that's Forge or not, I don't know if MSP partners have agreed that Forge is the new MSP, I don't know, but some sort of harmonized trading block where, it was never going to be just automakers selling cars into the United States that was going to provide the large enough market signal to bring ex-Chinese supplies of critical minerals online. You were always going to need to broaden the aperture beyond electric vehicles, which is what I see the silver lining of the killing of the 30D clean vehicle tax credit. It lets us talk about not just clean energy, but everything. And so I would put it to the Trump administration, let's put sourcing provisions on oil and gas credits, how much tungsten do you use in drill bits? How many drill bits do you need? Let's make sure that they're sourcing those drill bits from US sources, not from, foreign entities of concern. And it can go on and on and on. But yes, you need that large demand pull, especially if we're going to do this in a market-based way. It can't just be about clean energy, and it can't just be the United States, and it can't even just be the United States and the EU, and it can't even be just the United States, the EU, and the G7, and even the G7 plus, as we've seen it with Korea and Australia. The focus has been so much on producing countries And yes, of course, you need the producing countries, but again, you need the market signal to, just because we're producing more doesn't mean someone's going to buy it. And so how do you work with consuming countries? How do you bring in countries like Brazil, countries like India, that share the same values that we do, that are fed up with oversupply from China, also want to protect their own industries, and get them to also buy into a marketplace where they're only buying material for their key sectors that, you know, aligns and comports with our values. So that went above and beyond. But
Well, no, I'm going to extract from that something optimistic. You said about that government policy can matter. We have experience with that, so I'll take that. You also mentioned the word tariff. We're going to inch towards that, but maybe one way to do that, Matthias, if I could ask you, this U.S.-EU Critical Minerals Action Plan and the Memorandum of Understanding, there's a lot of ways that can be helpful. We can get to some of the more systemic ones in a second, but from your point of view, sitting in Berlin, how do you think that this transatlantic cooperation can be most helpful for Germany's interests?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's very important to note that here we have got a field where we have a lot in common. These days, there are also a lot of conflicts between the EU and the Trump administration. But I think here, starting with the analysis, and Abby Wolf has developed it really very, very precisely, I think we share the same analysis, and that's already a very good starting point. And I think that is basically what the Memorandum of Understanding and the action plan says. We face a challenge here, basically with one big partner, that is China, and we need economic and political answers to that challenge. And now let's explore measures. And also here, I talked to colleagues from the White House on this, and I think all the chapters you can have from the promotion of production of raw materials at home to cooperation with countries all over the globe that are producing raw materials, and how can you be more strategic on that, to measures like trade mechanisms or diversification requirements. I mean, all these chapters, I think we have a good mapping already in that MOU and in the action plan. And now we have to fill it with life. And I must say, we have to be cautious, really. I think nobody wants to be naive on this, because it's not only a matter of raw materials, it's also a lot about refining and processing. And let's face this, I just had 1 week ago or so, I had a huge meeting, a hearing with really some of the most important companies and corporates here in Germany. And that came out pretty clearly from a technical standpoint. It's not only the critical raw materials, but it's processing. And in particular, if you look into rare earths and permanent magnets, here China has developed a huge they are really in advance because they have developed technologies here, and it would be naive to say we can catch up in 1 or 2 years. So we have to look at each and every critical raw material and find answers here. I don't see really one answer for all of them, because the dependency is really different. There are fields where we can catch up, I think, quicker. But there are other areas or other critical raw materials where this is really more complex. And we have to look at this. And I say this because, yes, in the German economy, we still have a very, very large industrial basis, which is under competitive pressure. That's definitely the case. And we're working on that. But I think to your question, what can we do between the EU and Germany as part of the EU and the US, I think we can do a lot. But again, I think here also in terms of procedure, we have to really bring people around the table that are all involved. I wouldn't see an approach, wouldn't support an approach where the US now starts to negotiate one by one, pushing through their economic power. And for instance, talking with the EU, I think we must know, for instance, what is the precise view of Korea? What is the precise view of Australia? What is the precise view of Canada, a very dear partner to us? So we must find a setup in a truly plurilateral way. And let me say this also very clearly. Of course, this needs trust and confidence among partners. And quite clearly, we've been struggling with that because very clearly the US, the Trump administration has been very pushy on many fields, and we need a sense of cooperation, of trust and confidence here. And I think that's doable. And if we do that together in that setup, in a plurilateral setup, I think we can clearly find solutions, and that's my final point, will send a clear sign to China as a partner. You must take into account what your actions and your policies have as effect on our economies. We want to have an economic basis. We want industry in our own country. We have jobs to defend, and we want innovation in our own country. And if you stir a policy that really destroys others with overproduction, there will be a harsh conflict, and we don't want that. We want a sense of cooperation. And I think that setup, that plurilateral setup, and that's why we are in favor of it, is good if we have trust among us, and then it will send a strong signal to the Chinese partners.
And so, Abby, how do you see the value of working transatlantically versus, or maybe that not versus, but sort of as a seed for broader cooperation, bringing in some of the countries that Matthias mentioned? How do you see that?
It's incredibly important, and maybe to put a finer point on what Matthias was saying very diplomatically, countries are having to hedge against us now. And so what are the, and I'm not a trade expert, but what are the trade mechanisms in place that to help protect countries not only from coercion from China, but also potential coercion from any other player, be it the United States or somebody else? So that seems to be the challenge presented before our allies and the United States right now in trying to develop trade tools that can be trustworthy and not weaponized against potential allies in any specific way as well. Sort of going back to Matthias's earlier point on processing as well, yeah, there are some amazing European companies, German companies, chemical companies that could be really integral to helping us to reduce the Chinese choke point on minerals processing. The problem is, again, that they have to make money, and the market for those types of materials outside of China is very small right now, and they make most of their money selling chemicals into China and not necessarily battery chemicals. And so it's trying to then also figure out ways to covertly or behind the scenes sort of protect those companies so that you can encourage them to keep trucking on some of their, battery or other related chemical endeavors that may not be their money makers and that may actually put some of their money-making lines in jeopardy if, the CCP or others see them as, trying to elbow in on their market share. And it's not just processors, it's also miners. When you're talking about global mining conglomerates, you're predominantly talking about mining companies that they're mining ore and they're mining iron ore and they're mining coal, and they're sending those things to China. Their critical mineral mining operations are minimal and small and not their money makers, again. So it's very interesting sort of seeing the dynamics unfold between mining companies and governments, because that's sort of the other unspoken thing. And they're starting to splice themselves up in different ways in the previous administration, so that they could appear and be sort of more aligned with, green transition principles and sort of lob off their coal assets and focus more on battery metals. But at the end of the day, coal, iron ore, the base metals are the money makers, and trying to get big companies, again, with fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders to invest more in some of these low commodity materials where you're not entirely certain where the market is going to be. It's very difficult. And then layer in on top of that political uncertainty, again, operating within democracies, we've just seen very lucrative tax credits gone, snapped away in an instant. And again, the whole tariff conversation that's completely where companies' minds are when you talk about tariffs. They don't know if they're going to be there in 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, and how are you going to convince a company to invest millions, billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in an asset that's going to take them decades or longer? When you're talking about refining capacity, 3 to 5 years, but it's billions of dollars to do that. And then you have to add on qualification timelines to actually sell your goods into a mature and existing supply chain. And the proposition becomes incredibly tenuous for companies because they don't know if an incoming Democratic administration could make those tariffs go away in an instant if they wanted to prioritize deploying for clean energy faster than diversifying supply chains, which is a very real and valid tension within critical mineral supply chains. If you want to solve for climate as fast as possible, you probably want to use Chinese technology as quickly as possible. But that gets you in an incredibly precarious position, as we saw with the EU's reliance on Russian oil and gas with the war in Ukraine, how sideways and how badly that can go and how quickly.
2 more questions from me, then I'm going to open it up to all of you. The first one is, so China has been mentioned, of course, a lot. Is this mostly, almost all about China, or are there other economic security concerns that US-EU cooperation on critical minerals can also address? Matthias?
Well, my feeling is that the defense sector is a field where I think that idea of resilience is so important. And in a way, sometimes the very direct speech of President Trump was also helpful for us because it gave us the big shock in the field of defense that, yes, we have to do more. Like I said, in a certain way, when I talk about Germany, a lot of factors were very much in favor of our economic success that we really had. But a lot of the preconditions, we didn't have them really as clear as we should have had them in mind. Like the cheap energy or the stable energy we used to have from Russia. So in a way, rethinking also defense is important. For instance, in the field of defense, we have to define also where our key dependencies lie in the field of critical raw materials, and maybe our willingness then also to invest in this area becomes higher, or is there because it's so vital. Because the aggression of Putin against Ukraine is really just around the corner. So, and we don't want to have that really this area is in some respect also helpful because we see we have to act here. It's vital at the basis of our free life, of our democratic life, and here I see a lot of a good basis also for cooperation between the EU, Germany, and the US, because we, after all, we share the same values.
Is it more than China?
You're asking. Full disclosure, I'm a big China hawk. So for me, yes, it's all about China. So, I mean, it's just the facts of where we are right now. They control upwards of 70% of critical minerals supply chains, in some supply chains close to 100%. And they are very willing, and they've demonstrated their ability to weaponize that control to achieve their own gains. And in the United States, where you already have so much Chinese investment, CCP investment, so that, you had NBA players that had to stop, protesting against Chinese takeover over CCP takeover over Hong Kong because of the Chinese investment in the NBA, where you have Disney literally having to have their movies pre-screened before they can have them sold into Chinese audience. This level of coercion through different levels of our society and that's just movies and basketball, okay? When you're talking about things when they're talking about things that are going to be underpinning our entire way of life, again, data centers and AI that already have surgical export license controls on them right now, that's dangerous. And so yes, again, especially when it's against a strategic adversary that does not believe in freedom of speech, does not believe in elections, does not believe that government should be held accountable to people. That is very dangerous. So yes, it is all about China for me.
That's a clear answer. I heard the word trade, I heard the word tariffs, I even heard the word plurilateral. So those words speak to me. Matthias, let me ask you, how far do you think that Germany and the European Union are willing to go in this cooperation with the United States as a building block for a wider G7 plus cooperation? And I'm going to just throw out there the words World Trade Organization, just so you can sort of know what I'm getting at here, because there are a number of steps that could be taken, including a common external tariff. There are other steps that could be taken, maybe more standards-based, which might have different implications for international trade law. But, you know, how far, given the geoeconomic realities, you know, how far is Germany willing to go?
Yeah, I mean, we are we've always been in favor of the multilateral trading system, and we were very sorry that the multilateral system suffered because the dispute settlement body wasn't healthy anymore, because successors were nominated and all that. That happened under Trump 1. So for us, of course, WTO will always be important, and we still defend it. And for instance, also with a functioning WTO, one could address a lot of the issues in this field, because anti-dumping rules are part of the WTO system. However, the procedures are very long, they are heavy, so there are certain deficiencies. And I think I totally share the view of Abby Wolf that there is a sense of urgency in all this. So in that respect, I think we must look for new solutions. I would always say, let's find solutions that keep also the multilateral system in place. We shouldn't destroy it. That's very important. We need more cooperation. But in that, having said that, I think there is a lot of willingness among G7 partners. I'm also representing my country in a high-level group on raw materials, and I see a lot of will, together with the partners from Korea and Australia, to develop answers here, and also to have some kind of mechanisms, be it trade mechanisms or be it diversification requirements that could also be send an important signal, at least some kind of benchmarks that could then have an effect on offtake behavior of companies, also give a signal to the markets with regard to new investments. So yes, I think we can do something. We have to tackle this, and I think it's not an how can I say? It will then send a signal to the Chinese, but because after all, the Chinese, they are also dependent on us, on the rest of the world, so that kind of cooperation will have an impact on them, and that's I think what we want in the long run.
Abby, the Biden administration took some flack from Europe over the local content aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, have things changed? Have we moved on, or do you think that those sorts of things are still going to be sticking points?
I think that the Europeans are understanding the value of local content requirements. I mean, they're passing their own potential legislation that have local content requirements, and I think that is useful and good. the 45X production tax credits, only applied if you were producing things in the United States. The 30D clean vehicle tax credit for the battery had to be done in North America in order for it to be a qualifying asset for a clean vehicle, whereas minerals had to be mined, refined, or recycled within, a country with which we shared a free trade agreement. So it's not necessarily all local content requirements. I do think that those things are going to be very important, but again, they need to be harmonized among the US and the EU are going to be at cross odds if their incentives are not the same. I feel like, they need to be harmonized within the US, the EU, and again, those other major consuming countries. And for the WTO, I just feel like it's been, going back to your previous question, I was thinking about it while Mateus was speaking, it's just been bastardized a little bit, right? The WTO. I mean, you have, again, the US, the EU talking about price floors to hedge against China that we let into the WTO that has been taking advantage of our free market rules. The OECD just came out with a report saying that a lot of across key sectors, a lot of Chinese companies' net profits have come from subsidy, upwards of 60% in some key sectors from state subsidized action. And so now you have, again, we just had the DFC guy up here, OSC, hundreds of billions of US dollars going toward, helping to compete against, again, this non-market actor that we let into the WTO in an attempt to liberalize them, to make them look more like us, but instead we're all beginning to look more like China by over-subsidizing all these industries in an incredibly inefficient way. So I think that we need to recognize that they've taken advantage of those rules and really actually reinforce those rules. And again, as policymakers, sometimes you just need a blunt tool to, make that effect fully felt by the market and by the country that you want to change their behavior. So I don't know whether that's kicking China out of the WTO, recreating. Again, we have this ministerial talking about new rules-based systems. The G7 is talking about standards as a way to diversify critical minerals marketplaces. But I can poke holes in that argument all day as a way why that can't be a way to diversify supply chains, and why honestly those two conversations should be decoupled. But yeah, it's a complicated issue.
Rules matter. It just depends on what they are, who's setting, and what they're about. I think that's it's not as if rules we have to throw away rules. But yeah, there's a lot. The devil's in the details. Okay, I'm looking at our nice, pretty full house here, and looking at first of all at Emily Benson.
I'm very sorry to ask a second question, but this one is for our colleague in Berlin. As we have seen in this panel and the one that preceded it, the current and previous administrations in the US have tried to spin up a flywheel effect of creating resilient critical mineral supply chains. This is where NATO comes into particular importance, where relations are very tenuous right now. That does not obviate the need to shore up resilient supply chains for particularly the NATO defense industrial base. Some of that will inevitably involve American firms investing in European member states. How likely are any of those investments, and I know that the EU overall has had a very country agnostic approach to investment review, how likely would it be that any of these large scale billion-dollar plus investments in mines, refineries, processing facilities, new R&D endeavors, how likely is it that those types of transactions would be either caught in or substantially delayed by domestic investment review on national security grounds? Thank you.
This was a question to me?
I think it was.
I had a hard time to understand acoustically, so maybe could you
If the US wants to begin more earnestly investing in European member states for NATO defense supply chains to support the European defense industrial base, will those transactions be subject to investment review on national security grounds at the member state level?
My feeling is that would be an excellent sign to have more of that kind of investment and transatlantic cooperation and investment and trade. I think that would be really perfect. I mean, the public, how can I say, our feeling is that the US is somewhat taking back their attention to Europe and rather redirecting their attention to other areas or fields on the globe. And my feeling is there would be a lot of positive ground for that kind of enforced cooperation. Just looking at this discussion here, I don't know if there's any other country around the globe where there's so much common analysis, common thinking. Sometimes our answers differ, but the basis in terms of value and traditions is very, very strong. And I can only say I would be very much in favor of that kind of development you've been alluding to.
Do you guys know? No? Yeah.
Great. Hi. Travis Brubaker at E3G. We're a transatlantic climate and geopolitics think tank. This is for both panelists. Thank you for being here. One, we saw from the previous panel that there is a wide plethora of initiatives coming out of the US government regarding critical minerals, whether it be Project Forge or the MSP, like you mentioned, who knows, or whatever it may be. I was wondering how you track and prioritize those kind of relationships outside of government looking into coordinating with the US. And then a second question, this one may be more for Mateus, is you mentioned governments need to start looking at new novel ways of kind of doing industrial policy. The US, especially under the current administration, did that in a very big way through DOW with the MP materials. It's, I think, a 10% stake, 15. I was wondering if that's something that Germany or broader EU might be looking at. Thanks.
Do you want to go first, or?
No, you can go first. Thank you.
So maybe track and prioritize. I mean, can slice that and dice that any number of ways. I mean, from the perspective of like diversifying the supply chain, or from the perspective of like if you're a company wanting to attract attention there, which perspective?
Just
Sorry.
No worries. Just in general, kind of prioritizing where you would put your energy with associating with the current government initiatives.
Well, me personally, to create the marketplace, the harmonized incentives and tariffs that I think are necessary to create the large demand pull needed to create the certainty to bring a non-Chinese asset online, I would be focusing on the ministerial and the trade bloc, the bilateral conversations that are going on that could potentially become a multilateral conversation, I think is plurilateral, whatever the goal. That is where I would be focusing the most. Project Vault is suffering from like severe mission creep. I think that there certainly was value in developing like a 60-day emergency stockpile to help to prevent what happened with Ford having to shut down their facility for a week during the trade tit for tat. Like that was, in my opinion, I left before those discussions had started, but that is a good use of funds, I think, and something that was missing as sort of an economic band-aid. But does that in and of itself help to solve supply chain diversification? No. You probably need something more along the lines of a stockpile that Australia is standing up with their critical mineral strategic reserve that is actually more focused on setting the price floor, so to speak, for key assets within their country. But that again speaks to, from the Australian point of view, mining makes up about 10% of its GDP, whereas in the US, it makes up it's 1% of our GDP. So yes, that I would be focusing on the bigger sort of market making aspects.
Yeah. And to the question, In fact, my feeling is that a lot in the US is in some respect a good role model. Project Vault, for instance, with regard to stockpiling, we are really closely looking at that. With regard to investments into raw materials projects themselves, it's dangerous, one has to say, because as a state, you really have to be very smart. Our system, our investment works always together with private investors, and on the basis that there is an offtake relation also to German industry. So it has to meet certain criteria that are also market based. But I think also taking these prerequisites, one can do a lot in order to have alternative supply chains. As Australia and Canada were mentioned, we are really closely working together with both countries because through the strategic reserve, Australia is now developing, or Canada is also building up such a system. They are solving a problem, I think, of first offtakes in their own country from mining projects, but they're offering this also to privileged partners abroad or other countries, and that's exactly, I think, what we need. That kind of production alliance. I think the new development we are now seeing is really the idea of a buyers club. And I think we can really, if we do that in a smart way, as G7 countries and also within our systems, we can develop ways to diversify. It will take some time, but it's doable.
We have 2 minutes left. One more question. Tobias?
Thank you. Tobias Gerke, European Council on Foreign Relations. 2 very brief questions, one for Matthias. On demand side policies, Matthias, how much could you tell us a little bit more if you would like to use more public procurement to create new demand for alternative supply chains? For example, when you auction a wind farm, you could put a condition in that the wind park developer needs to use alternative rare earth magnets, for example. Is that something you're dealing with? Would be interesting to hear a bit more. Abby, one quick question. If you were in charge of the price floor kind of conversation on the trade side, which are the 2, 3 minerals or derivatives that you think that's what we should try? That's what we should now just try what goes.
I'm going to let you go first this time.
Yeah, thank you. With regard to public procurement, of course, it is a good tool to promote, be it recycling or be it alternative sourcing. However, I also have to say one has to do it in conformity with market rules. Otherwise, we would have too heavy procedures, and time is very, very important in these kind of projects. So I think it's a tool that we can use, and there are also discussions exactly in this direction. Thank you.
I know. So my nit to pick with one of my nits to pick with the standard price floor conversation too is the other reason why it's so tricky is when you're looking at allied deposits across the cost curve, they're not all nicely grouped together. You might have one allied deposit that's over here in the middle of the cost curve. You might have one allied deposit that's over here at the way high end of the cost curve. So how do you develop a price floor that allows for both of those deposits to benefit while not letting, maybe there's a non-allied asset that's sitting in between them that could then also benefit from that price floor, which is why you also need the tariff rate quotas to help with that. And so you have then, we're so much higher on the cost curve because we are held to a higher regulatory standard. And so if you just then harmonize the cost on ESG, then you would also get to a different kind of price floor that would maybe help to fill in any gaps with any just like purely economic cost curve problem. But that also belies the fact that there are for lithium, for example, you have brine deposits, you have hard rock deposits, you've got clay deposits, and so you also need to account for the cost of extracting the lithium from those different types of geologic deposits. So I feel like the minerals that I would choose first would be the kinds where there are very limited variability in their deposits, so that you know they all have to be mined in a somewhat similar way. And so the economic deviations between one deposit to another doesn't necessarily have to do because, well, this one's an evaporation pond and this one you need heavy equipment to like dig it up out of the ground. Maybe I would also choose something where I would look across all the cost curves and try to find the one where all the allied deposits were closer together relative to the other ones.
A values-based price floor to a certain extent. Do you want to have something? Okay. So then on behalf of Penny Nass and the German Marshall Fund, I want to thank all of you in person and online for joining us for our program today. I want to thank Matthias Köder in Berlin from the German Ministry of Economic Affairs, Abby Wolf here in Washington for being our panelists, and from myself and the American German Institute, thanks very much and hope you have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.